So I wanted to talk a little bit about the problems of science. And science actually is a religion that doesn't have the balls to admit it's a religion. It's a set of beliefs and has no more validity or no greater validity than any other set of beliefs. Because we believe in it though, and because it pervades our social conscience, we think it does have more validity, and we think it has a kind of strength behind it that we couldn't possibly argue with. And to be called something like a scientist, or to have a scientific method, or to be thoroughly scientific is seen as praiseworthy. And that's really unfortunate, because although the scientific method has an awful lot to commend it, and it's certainly a good way of moving through the world and dealing with problems, it has a lot that it just can't cope with, and yet steadfastly refuses to cope with it. And that's really unfortunate. Now, at its very basics, if you like, as a worldview, it's essentially based on a lie. Now, a guy called Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley, actually proposed this, and it's an interesting idea, that if you have 3 tubs of water, so you get a tub of hot water, and you can do this at home if you like, a tub of cold water, and in between you have a tub of medium temperature water. And you put one hand in the hot, one hand in the cold, leave them there so they acclimatise, pick them out and put them in the medium temperature. Then to the hand that was in the cold, that water will feel hot. To the hand that was in the hot, that water will feel cold. So the water that you've now got both hands in will feel hot and cold at the same time. So what does that tell you? It can't possibly be hot and cold at the same time, and yet we're sensing it as hot and cold at the same time. And what it tells you is that it's more than possible, actually quite easy, for our senses to be lied to. And we all know that. There's tons and tons of optical illusions kicking around there, where you appear to see something that you don't actually see. Now, science will tell you that by careful measurement, you can get rid of that stuff, so we can take some kind of external measurement. We can use a thermometer to tell us what the actual temperature of those 3 buckets of water is, and we can look at that thermometer. What it neglects to say is that we're looking at that thermometer using sensors that we just used. So knowing that our senses can be lied to us doesn't help to then bring a machine and say, look, this machine tells us this. Because our senses are still perceiving that machine. It is actually through our senses that we perceive the world. Whatever machines we construct, we still perceive those machines through our senses. Now, this is called the lens theory. That everything is perceived through the lens of our own perception. So we actually have no assurity that what we're perceiving is actually the world as it really is. And that's got an awful lot of force behind it. Now, Bertrand Russell was talking about this, and he talked about Einstein's theory. And Einstein's theory is that matter warps space. Now, what we are able to perceive is the warping field. We can't actually perceive the matter per se. We perceive the effect that it has, the field that it generates, and that's what we're measuring. So when we measure the field, we can never get to measure the actual matter that creates that field. So Russell said, well, how do we know that matter actually exists? We know that the field exists, certainly, but the matter isn't necessary. It doesn't have to exist. All that has to exist is the field. So if the matter doesn't exist, and all we have is all these fields interacting with each other, then we have no assurity of the reality of matter. And the reality of matter and the measurement of that reality is the basis of science. So science is based on the measurement of something that actually may or may not exist, and we perceive it through a whole set of sensors that we know are being lied to. So our whole perception of the world is skewed. Now, that's a philosophical argument, and of course what we do with philosophical arguments is, if we don't agree with them, we ignore them completely, and that's fine. Because every time I go down to sit down on a chair or pick up a cup of hot coffee, I don't ask myself, does that chair exist? Am I going to end up on the floor? I just sit down on it. And this is another thing that science will say. What I've done is made a test. I've made a hypothesis. The chair exists. When I sit down, I won't fall down. I sit down, and I confirm that hypothesis. And through repeated test, then I get to have faith in the world, that my hypothesis about the world is correct. And to an extent, that's perfectly true. But the whole thing, and this is where science doesn't really agree with it, the whole thing is based on a fundamental set of beliefs. And those fundamental set of beliefs are that the world exists. And given that, we then construct the edifice of science on it. And this reminds me of my Economics 101. Now, I did Economics 101 when I was at university, like so many other people. And the first thing you learn in Economics 101 is that everything else you're going to learn thereafter is just utter tosh. because they set up a whole load of precepts. They tell you that there's a certain amount of conditions that you have to accept, and one of them is that we are infinite consumers, that given a chocolate bar, we'll eat it. Given a second chocolate bar, we'll eat that too, and we'll continue eating them forever. We will always consume. Individuals are seen as infinite consumers. Resources are seen as finite. Consumption is seen as infinite. Therefore, we need some structure, the market structure as it happens, to coordinate those finite and infinite. And given those precepts, we construct economics on them. The problem with it, of course, is that consumption isn't infinite. Now, economics deals with this by talking about marginal utility. That is, the first chocolate bar that you eat, you really enjoy. The second one you eat, you don't enjoy as much as the first because you're now a bit full, and so you have this utility difference between the first and the second, and that diminishes over time and getting smaller and smaller. It never disappears incidentally, it just gets smaller. Now, I'm not an infinite consumer. And I know I'm not an infinite consumer. I actually get pretty much what I want, and then when I have those things, I don't seek anything else to consume. I don't really bother much with things, to be honest. And there are certain goods, of course, that you can infinitely consume, within a level, actually. Entertainment is one of those goods you can infinitely consume. You can watch something again and again and again, or you can continue watching something, or you can go to a show and it doesn't actually give you anything but enjoyment. So entertainment actually to our world is really, really important because it's something that we can consume endlessly. And it really fits in with that model. Even then, we don't consume endlessly. People get bored of watching television. If you've ever tried to sit all day and watch TV, you will know how upset you get. You feel like you've wasted the day and that you have to do something else. So this idea of infinite consumption is just utter nonsense, really. But once it's been established, then they construct this edifice of very impressive mathematics on that whole thing. But it's a house of sand. It's a house built on sand. It's going to quickly fall down. And unfortunately for science, science is very similar. It's actually a house built on sand. It's built on the belief that the real world exists and that we can measure it. Now, there are so much more to the world than that. I mean, ideas, for instance, are one of those things that inform and develop and are tremendously important to us and don't exist out there. And you can test that concept yourself if you want. Just get a ruler, think of an elephant and try to measure the distance between your idea of the elephant and the table you sat next to. Can't be done. So when you look at the world and you have this world of ideas and this world as it really is, they make two separate circles that there's no real interconnection with, and this gives a big, big problem. And Descartes hit this problem when he was talking about the problem of the Turks. The problem with the Turks is that when you fire cannonballs at attacking Turks, the cannonballs hit them. But when you want to calculate how much powder to put in there, what elevation you need to put the gun at, then that's a mental exercise, an idea. So you work that out, you then put that into practice. So why is it that the idea of the trajectory of the cannonball actually matches the real cannonball? And this was a big problem for Descartes. And this kind of duality has been a problem with our conception of the world for hundreds of years. And it's not one that's gone away, it's still there. Yeah, why is it that our ideas of the world match the world? And there's no justifiable answer to it, to be honest. And it's one that philosophers are seeking and have failed totally to find. And it's one that scientists ignore and pretend doesn't exist. And what this means is that whole structure of things is fundamentally a belief system. Now, there's nothing wrong with belief systems. It's how we move through the world. We make a guess at what the world is going to be. We have some ideas about how we want to interact with it and what kind of relationships we want to have with it, and then we move through the world with those ideas in mind. And if those ideas are challenged, actually we don't change our ideas very much. We kind of get entrenched in them, and we get frustrated and angry and upset if the world doesn't match our ideas of the world. And this is exactly what happens in science as well. Science is supposed to progress through a process of what's called falsificationism. So you have an idea, a law, a rule about the way something behaves. You test it. It doesn't behave according to your law. You're supposed to either modify the law or throw it out and build a whole new law. Now, that actually rarely happens. What happens is, and this happens time and time again, the entrenched scientific view becomes frustrated and angry. and you get the academics up in arms, and you get them writing papers and vilifying people, and Newman was particularly bad about this, incidentally. He actually hounded a guy out of the academy because he just didn't like the fellow. Nothing to do with science, it was to do with being a person. So science tries to put itself upon that pedestal, the pedestal of godhood. We have the ultimate answer to all truth. And if you try to assail science, then you are seen as assailing truth. And if you assail truth, then you must be a Philistine and you should be cast out of Eden. And that's exactly how scientists behave. As people, they behave like that. They don't tell you they behave like that. They tell you that, no, we test a theory. If the theory isn't right, then we change the theory. Well, that happens extremely rarely. In fact, so rarely it's got a special name. It's a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts only ever happen after a tremendous amount of struggle. And usually an awful lot of people have been ruined or vilified or destroyed in their career because their view of the world didn't match the academic view of the world, the institutionalized scientific view of the world. And the problem of science is not only to do with the philosophical basis of it, that the philosophical basis is just a belief system. It's also to do with the fact that it's run by people. And people are both wonderful and frightful things at the same time. I have two views of people, depending on how I feel at a particular time. One view is that there are a whole bunch of penguins in the North Pole, and when it snows they all huddle together for warmth and they try to help each other. And that's a very Rousseau-esque notion, a noble savage notion. And when I'm thinking like that, I think people are great, and really we all ought to help them. Help each other and move through the world together. And I know it's a bit sort of Star Trek, but that truly is the bulk of the time the way I think about people. But then there's the other side of people. And the other side of people, I like to think of them as monkeys. If you ever go to the zoo and you see the chimpanzees in the chimpanzee house and they're a bit riled up, what they spend the time doing is screaming at each other and throwing their own shit at everybody. And people do that too. And that's just the way people are. People are both noble and ignoble at the same time. Oddly enough, we're at our most noble when we're at our most stressed. When people have times of comfort and ease, then actually we're pretty ignoble and we do some pretty damned foolish things. We really do. Now, our current society, of course, is a society of relative ease. We don't really worry about things too much. Most people are reasonably comfortable. Our ideas of poverty are if you don't have two colour televisions and you take less than 2 weeks holiday a year, you're supposed to be poor. That's a pretty bizarre view of poverty, but that's the one that we currently have. And so it tells you we live in a fairly indolent society. And that breeds a kind of contemptuous view of things where people don't really take things seriously. They do the most bizarre things. You put people in a different situation, you put them in a war, for instance, then suddenly you find the most noble of behaviours coming out. So people are most noble when the situation they're in is the most stressful, that they really rise to great occasions. We have a difficulty as a race in rising to great occasions when we don't really have the need to rise to great occasions, and that's a real shame. But hopefully we can learn from our past, and that will move us forward. But all that stuff aside, science is run by people, and you have to realise this. And people have both a noble and an ignoble side to them. And they have a great deal of entrenched interest. Now, an awful big reason for the fact that entrenched and academic science likes to hold dearly to its views and its ideas is that that's how they get their wages. There's a lot of money paid into this sort of stuff, standard theory and standard exploration and grant bids and all that kind of thing to maintain the status quo. And those who are in the status quo and riding that gravy train are really quite happy to maintain it. In fact, so much so that they will be fairly vitriolic in their attack at anybody who tries to instigate that paradigm shift, that new idea. People don't like new ideas upsetting the gravy train when there's a nice gravy train running. So there's another problem with science. Not only is its fundamental belief system a belief system in the same way that the belief in God is a belief system, it's run by people who can be very hypocritical. And that leaves an awful lot of people out in the cold. Because another problem with science is it likes to mystify. it likes to create a whole set of jargon and words and equations and verbiage around it that we're supposed to understand before we enter into the great halls of science. Now, to my mind, science is actually very little more than investigating the world around you. Now, the world is a truly interesting and fascinating place with some great things going on in there, where you look at them and you think, I wonder why, or can I make that better? That kind of thing. Now, that ought to be the remit of anybody. Anybody who's got an interest in it ought to be able to ask themselves those kind of questions and investigate those kind of answers, and why not? And I think, personally, that anybody who's doing that is perhaps not a scientist in the same way that we understand a scientist, that is, in a rigid social way of understanding scientists, but to my mind, an investigator, and that's far more important than science. Science has developed now as well that the mystification process is so important that if you don't use the right terminology, the right jargon, the right buzzwords, then you're ridiculed for it, dressed down, told that, oh no, you should be using the right nomenclature. And this just really annoys me, because it's not the way that you're saying something that is tremendously important, it's the idea that you're trying to get across that's tremendously important. Now, another thing that science does, of course, is when it's developed its little laws and its little rules, it tells you that they're cast in stone, that should you question those laws and those rules, then again, you're a Philistine and worthy of casting out of Eden. But then, how do things develop unless people are actually questioning them? If you don't question things, if you don't try to find your own answers or try to find different answers to the answers that you're being given, there will be no progress. Now, what is progress? Well, to my mind, progress is not the acquisition of more things. Things are just things. You get a certain level of things where you live a comfortable life, but after that, what more do you need? You don't need hundreds of millions of pounds. It's just a waste of time, a waste of money to seek such things, and yet there are a few people who seek such things. And to me, it's slightly mad. I think progress is one of those things where you seek to understand your world. You seek to explore it thoroughly. And that is what I think, really, science and we ought to be about. Anyway, I hope that was of interest to you. I know a bit philosophical and I know a bit wordy, but maybe of interest. So, thank you for watching.